So let's talk a little bit about this transition that the Mission Indians went through from living in their traditional villages to living in the California missions. In particular, we'll talk about how these differences affected their health. Okay, so in a traditional village for some tribes, now keep in mind that there are a number of different tribes in California, and many have their own types of traditional dwellings. But for many California Indians, they would live in non-permanent houses. Okay, meaning that their homes would sometimes be made of grasses or tule grass, and they would look something like this. This right here is a depiction of what a traditional California home would look like. Okay, so like the local tribe here in San Diego, the Kumeyaay, their homes would look like this. If you go north to Los Angeles, you'd find the Tongva or Gabrielinos. Their homes would look like this as well. There's a number of tribes who lived in these types of homes, right? And so this is, it's kind of like a grass hut, right? And they could be large, they could be small, a number of different sizes of these types of dwellings. Now, these dwellings were not permanent, meaning that they could be built, and if there was an issue, maybe if the place was not clean, or if there was some damage, they could simply be burned and you can build a new one. Okay, it's not the same as an adobe house. If you have an adobe house, that thing is going to be there for generations, right? You may fix it up a little bit, but pretty much it's a permanent dwelling. It's not going to be burned to the ground and a whole new adobe house being built. Okay, so that's one of the differences that you would find in the traditional villages. Now, also, in the traditional villages, there was a much lower population density. You didn't have large numbers of people living in close quarters. Instead, their homes would be separate from each other. There'd be some distance between them. You'd have smaller populations living in a traditional village. There was much more larger populations living in closer quarters at the California missions. Okay, now this has an effect, right? When you have more people living closer together, there is more of a chance that diseases could spread among that population. If the traditional village is much more sparsely populated, right, not as many people, and there's more distance between them, there's less likelihood that disease would spread amongst everybody in the village. Okay, so that density of population has an effect on the spread of disease in the California missions. Okay, now in general, the housing in the traditional villages was much more sanitary. Okay, why are they more sanitary than an adobe house? It's because they're non-permanent dwellings. Okay, so say there was an infestation, maybe there were some parasites that got into the home. Well, that would be one of the occasions when the traditional dwelling would be burned to the ground, and they would move to a new location and build a new dwelling, a new grass hut, right? And so that is much more sanitary than an adobe house. If you have the spread of disease or parasites in an adobe house, it's a lot more difficult to clean it, and it's more likely that people will end up catching those parasites or diseases. Okay, and so the conditions in the missions were much different. You have larger, denser populations, more people living closer together, easier for diseases to spread. They're living in permanent homes, adobe houses, so if diseases spread in those homes, or if they're unsanitary, you can't just burn them up and build a new one, right? It takes a lot more labor. It's less likely that that's going to happen. Okay, there'll probably just be some feeble attempt to try to clean it, and people could still get sick if it's not properly cleaned. Okay, now the reason why people are living in these adobe houses, one of the reasons, is so that they could be controlled. Right? It's all about social control. Just like the dormitories are controlling the girls, the unmarried girls, you have these adobe houses in general controlling the population so that they're stuck there at the mission. You know where they're at, right? And there's a wall built around the mission in some cases, so that the people can't escape. It's all about social control. Now, some people may have lived in the missions willingly, but many did not. Many were forced to stay there. They were forced to work at the missions, and so, in a sense, this is a form of captivity. Now, other changes away from the traditional lifestyle that the Native Americans at the missions experienced were changes in their clothing. okay, what they wore on a regular basis. Now, once the natives moved to the California missions, they were forced to wear wool or cotton clothing. Now, this is different from what they would normally wear. And they were only given one set of clothes for a period of time, could be for a whole year. Okay, so you have to wear the same thing every day. Now, with this type of clothing, wool clothing or cotton clothing, not only is it more uncomfortable than traditional clothing. I don't know if you've ever wore wool clothing before, but if you're wearing wool and if it's warm outside, it could be very itchy and extremely uncomfortable. But also, this type of clothing was more likely to contain parasites, right? And so if you are living in unsanitary conditions and if there are parasites there, it's more likely that the parasites would live in this one set of clothing, right, that you're wearing every day, wearing this wool clothing or cotton clothing, than if you were wearing traditional clothing. Okay, so if you're wearing, a pair of pants and a shirt, or if you're wearing a wool dress, it's very likely that you may catch some type of parasites in that clothing, right, or germs on that clothing because you're wearing it every day. It's one set of clothes. Now, if you're wearing traditional clothing, it could be a different situation because traditional clothing was throwaway clothing, meaning that it's disposable. You don't have to have the same outfit every single day, like if you were wearing a wool dress, if you were a woman. Instead, women in some Californian cultures would be wearing a grass skirt, right? And men would be wearing a loincloth, right? Something to cover up their private parts, but for the most part, they're not wearing very much clothing at all. Okay, now if it was cold, they may wear some type of cloak or blanket to keep them warm. But the weather in California, it doesn't get that cold in a lot of the areas. Okay, and so if people are used to having their skin exposed to the elements, they really don't have a need for a lot of clothing. And so that's why you have sparse amounts of clothing on California natives. And so that clothing, if it was just a loincloth, like a real small loincloth or a grass skirt, those are the type of things that could be thrown away if they get dirty or if they get parasites in them. You can easily burn them, get rid of them, and make a new set of clothing, right? I mean, it may not be that easy. It may take some work and some time, but it could be done. And that's one way to keep yourself clean. But with this one set of clothes that is given to Native Americans that they have to wear every day, it's more likely that those clothes are not going to be as clean as they could be, and parasites could live in that type of clothing more so than they could in the traditional style of clothing. Now, in addition to the clothing that people wore, there were also changes in their working conditions, okay, for both men and women. So first, let's talk about the working conditions in the traditional setting, within the traditional village, and the working conditions in the California missions. All right, so in the traditional village, the primary job of the man is to hunt, right? The man would go out, he would hunt animals, and he would bring them back, and that would be one of the food sources for the people in the town or the village. Okay. Another duty of men would be to conduct warfare. And there wasn't always war amongst the California tribes, but every now and then there would come a time where there would be warfare between various groups, and that would be one of the jobs of men. Okay. Of course, there were other jobs as well, various crafts that men would make, but primarily men would be responsible for the hunting, and that would be providing the daily sustenance for the group. Now, women also were responsible for bringing food to the family, but instead of hunting, women would be gathering plant goods, right? And so women would gather plant foods, and then they would also prepare the food as well. There would be cooking, right? It's not like they just ate everything raw. No, sometimes there was many hours that went into preparing certain foods, and that would be the job of women. Okay, so women were gathering plants. Women were gathering various foods, seeds, and they were preparing that food. That's the traditional work within the normal village within California Native societies. And I'm just generalizing here. I'm sure there were a number of different jobs depending on the tribe, but basically, there was hunting and gathering going on in the majority of tribes in California. Now, Once the tribes transitioned to the California missions, then that, of course, was a different story. Okay, there on the missions, they were responsible for forced labor. Okay, meaning that the friars, with the support of Spanish military troops, were forcing the natives to work for them. And what kind of work were they doing? Well, agriculture was a big duty. It was one of the major duty because basically now the tribes were responsible for growing the food that would feed not only the native people but also the missionaries, the military, and Spanish settlers who lived in their own towns in California. Okay, so agriculture becomes one of the main duties. Now, who's going to be doing the agriculture? Well, both men and women, but primarily it would be men on the California missions, right? So this is a huge change for Native men because normally they're used to being out hunting, they're mobile, they're moving around, they're traveling to different areas. Totally different from staying in one place and just working as a farmer. Okay, the men were not used to that. That was more closer to what women would be doing, right? That was women's work. So this is a huge shift psychologically for California Native men. Okay, so they can't go out hunting anymore. Now they're stuck on the missions in some cases, working the fields, right? And that's women's work, right? So you could imagine how that affected their minds, and you know what they considered the duties of a man was, right? Totally went against their traditional ideas of work for men, okay? Working in agriculture. But that wasn't the only type of work that they did. You also had California Native men involved in construction. They were actually the ones building the missions, right? They were building all those buildings. I'm not sure if you've ever been to one of the California missions, but there's many of them still standing. The one in San Gabriel recently was burned down. I'm not sure if you guys heard about that. But yeah, you can go to one of the California missions and check out the buildings, and those buildings were built by the Native people, okay? And so they were involved in construction. They built the churches, they built the dormitories, they built their own adobe homes. All of that was built by the California Native people, okay, under the direction of the Spanish. So you have agriculture, you have construction, but that's not it. There's other type of work that is done as well at the California missions, such as textile production, right? Textile is cloth. And so you had that type of work being done at the missions as well, right? So basically, the missionaries were using the California Native people as a labor force, and they were forcing them to do so. If the Native people fought back, then the Spanish military would be brought in to punish them, okay? And so it was forced labor at the California missions. And this is totally different from the type of traditional work that was done in native villages, so it has a psychological impact on the men and women. Okay, so women were working as well, as I mentioned earlier. So women, they could be working in light agriculture, right? Or they could be working in the textile production. So women were working as well, even if they were pregnant. And so you have to keep this in mind, what it was like to live at the California missions for the Native people, right? They're forced to work these jobs that they never worked in before, and sometimes went against their ideas of what is proper work, depending on your gender, okay? Went against their gender norms in some cases.